Thank you very much. Thanks for this kind introduction. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. We already practiced, so hopefully this works okay. So it's great to be here. It's quite an honor to be here, to have this invitation and speak in front of such a distinguished group. This is actually the first presentation of this study. We're due to present it, I think, in all 11 EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe, but you're the first. And so I'm especially interested in what you have to say, comments, and maybe especially criticism that you have. It would be very useful and interesting for me to hear. I should present the whole study. I mean, it's 65 pages in 20 minutes. So obviously I can only give you a very big picture at the start, but my idea would be just to introduce the main topics and the main conclusions, at least, as a basis for a discussion. I'm presenting on behalf of more than 10 people here. So this, I want to emphasize that as well. It's just a lot of work by a lot of people. It is far from only my work. And I think you get the slides at the end, and everybody is named in the final slides who worked on this project. There were 4 things I was going to do in these 20 minutes. I will talk very briefly about the aims of the research, just what we wanted to do, our basic hypotheses. Then I will talk about the sort of mega trends, or the endogenous and the exogenous challenges that we see for the growth model, and the main things we thought about in that part of the paper. Then, kind of bringing all of that together, I will discuss or present our SWOT analysis that we were asked to do as part of the study. And then I'll finish with the policy proposals. Again, I mean, I cannot go into depth in 20 minutes, but I will at least hint the sort of main areas that we think are important for policymakers to think about in terms of the challenges we identify. So in terms of the research, the hypotheses that we started with, I tried to group them a bit into 3 broad categories. So the first is that for the EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe, at least for the most developed, for countries like Slovenia and Czechia, as we now call it, the growth model may be hitting the limits. Certainly the convergence process for these countries has slowed a lot in the last decade or so. And that functional specialization patterns, and I'll talk about them a bit more in the second part of the presentation, could imply something a development trap, could imply something of hitting the limits. The second broad sort of hypothesis is that there are these new exogenous challenges hitting the region, the so-called megatrends. And these existed before the pandemic. This study was commissioned actually before the pandemic started, but they existed before, but they have been intensified or changed, or they're a bit different, obviously, in light of the pandemic. And these are things like demographic factors, environmental factors, technological change. And altogether, this is in a way a second transition for Central and Eastern Europe. And we know that, from the first transition, a lot of negatives in that, a lot of risks in that. But we also wanted to think about the opportunities in this second transition as well. The third part of this broad hypothesis is that a lot of the ideas that people talk about in terms of developing growth models and meeting the demographic or environmental, technological challenges of the present and future, things like national champions, the classic sort of Japanese, South Korean model, or the entrepreneurial state, which is pushed a lot in Western Europe, are not necessarily applicable to Central and Eastern Europe, or at least not in the ways that they're typically formulated for different reasons. And we need solutions specific to Central and Eastern Europe. So this is the kind of basic framework that we started with. And then what we did is 3 steps. We looked at the endogenous and the exogenous challenges, identified them, measured them as much as we could. We then evaluated all of this in the SWOT analysis, as I already said, and then we proposed the policy steps to manage this second transition in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, putting all these things together, these shocks, these endogenous, exogenous challenges and megatrends, for this presentation, I framed it in a sense of 5 pressure points for the region. I tried to group it into five things which are kind of a challenge or an opportunity for the region in terms of a changing growth model. The first one is about FDI and functional specialization. So there's a well-known story. Everybody here knows this story. Strong FDI inflows into the region for 25 years or so now have driven technology transfer, have helped to develop a very sophisticated export sector, have helped convergence progress. On the left, you see a very nice visualization, I think, from the report of the way that FDI works in the region. So this is inward outward FDI. One means basically no outward FDI. -1 equals, sorry, -1 is no outward FDI, +1 is no inward FDI. The orange are the Central and Eastern European countries, the gray bars are Western European countries. So you can see very clearly the region's member states are very reliant on FDI and don't have very much outward FDI. Interestingly, less so for Hungary than the other countries, but Hungary also is a negative on this chart. And we see then the right, one of the implications of that is that foreign firms account for a huge share of value added in the EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe. And that's especially the case in manufacturing. So the gray bars are total economy, orange bars are manufacturing, and then the dots are the EU average for each one. So you can see basically the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, especially in manufacturing, the share of foreign firms in value added is much higher than for the EU as a whole. One of the implications of this has been, so as I said, it's driven technology transfer, it's allowed the development of this very sophisticated export sector, but it's also generated a very big specialization, and we argue over specialization in production. So this chart shows relative production specialization, with 1 being the average for the global sample. And you can see that Central and Eastern European countries, which are mostly in the orange, but Slovakia and Hungary, which are even more so in the red, have a very high relative of production specialization. So less in headquarter services, less in research and development, less in logistics, much more in production, particularly considering how developed they are. So these are relatively developed economies in the global sample. And this is where we get to the idea of a potential development trap, that the countries are not expanding along the value chain into parts of the value chain where more value is created. So R&D, for example, logistics headquarters, things I've already mentioned, and much more in the production part of the value chain, which is where relatively less value is created. So this is clearly now, we think, a challenge, and especially considering the development level of the economies, they should have more specialization also in other parts of the value chain as well. The second key pressure point, as I've termed it here, and it's very much linked to the first, is the high reliance on automotive exports. And this, we think, is not really changing. It's not changing fast enough anyway. And it exposes the region to a major structural change underway, which we all know in the automotive industry, things are changing. Combustion engines are on their way out, and Central and Eastern Europe is extremely vulnerable to this. And especially the 4 Visegrad countries, including Hungary, Slovenia and Romania, these 6. So the left shows passenger car production per year, and you see a very sharp increase, which Hungary's played a very important part in over the last 20 years or so. And then on the right is the share of automotive industry exports in total exports. It's very high for all countries. It's around a quarter for Hungary, also for Czechia and Romania. It's around a third for Slovakia. And obviously, these are countries which have, in general, huge export reliance. So this is a big share of a big share. And this is a clear area as we go into this huge transition in the automotive sector, a clear area of vulnerability for the region as well. The third part, the third pressure point, is the green transition. And here in the study, we tried to correct some of the misconceptions which we see about the region, which is basically that the region is against this green transition, the region is not prepared for it, the region is way behind Western Europe. And that's not necessarily true. It might be true in relation to, the very front runners in Scandinavia, but compared to a lot of Western Europe, it's not actually the case. I can't show the whole story here, but just a couple of points I wanted to show. On the left, we show economic development related to greenhouse gas emissions. And we see a very clear decoupling actually over the last 20 years. So a lot of economic development, that's the gray line, and then, but actually declining greenhouse gas emissions, that's the orange line. So decoupling, and I don't have space to show the whole story here, but it's actually a much stronger, okay, from a lower starting point, but a much stronger rate of decoupling than in Western Europe over this period. On the right, then, my colleague is very much interested, Nico Kopa wrote this section, is very interested in this Eco-Innovation Index and the whole story of innovation in the green economy in Central and Eastern Europe. So not only absorbing technologies from the rest of the world, but also innovating itself. And you can see, okay, the region is behind the EU average in general, but some parts, at least the so-called front runners of the region, so Slovenia or Czechia, for example, are very much level with the EU average in terms of eco-innovation, getting even towards the EU 15 level. So this is a challenge. The region's starting point is in a way quite low, but we see some positive developments and some reasons for optimism in this green transition for Central and Eastern Europe. The fourth pressure point is digitalization, and we know from the pandemic the digital economy has had a huge push. And an example is this meeting right now. I think if it wasn't for the pandemic, we would all be in Hungary together. And here we also find, and as I said, this study was commissioned before the pandemic, so we were looking already at this issue before the pandemic. Actually, also some reasons for optimism in a certain already level of development in Central and Eastern Europe in the digital economy. So the chart on the left shows the contribution of ICT to real GDP growth in percentage points for different period averages for Central and Eastern Europe. And you can see that for many countries, there's a positive development. So as we go from the time periods back to 2011 up to 2019, ICT in many countries, and Hungary is very much an example of this, is playing an increasingly important role as a driver of economic growth. Obviously, Estonia is famously the leader in the region on this, but there are also other countries which are doing pretty well. On the right then, in another chart from the study, my colleague who did this part is very much interested in this ADP technology, so advanced digital production technologies. And you can see also here, Central and Eastern European countries are not doing especially badly compared to the EU 28 average, which we have there towards the right. Also have Finland, which is the leader in Europe. So of course, nobody can match Finland. Central and Eastern Europe is also behind the very front runners, but compared to the EU as a whole, it's not an especially bad story. And Hungary also within that, for example, in industrial robots, in manufacturing, compares relatively well with other countries in the region. What we also find is another element, I think, of a more positive story is that the region's young people seem quite well prepared for the digital revolution. So this chart shows individuals with above basic level, people with above basic level industrial digital skills. The gray bar is the total. Italy and Netherlands are the best and worst in the EU, so that shows you the whole. Range in Western Europe. Sorry, that shows you the whole range. And then we have the Central and Eastern European countries. And the gray bar you can see for the whole population. The region doesn't do especially well. It's very much below the EU average, pretty much everywhere. That's the gray dotted line. But for younger people, actually, Central and Eastern Europe looks pretty good. 5 countries are above the EU average in this age group. A few others are quite close. This is unfortunately an area where Hungary does less well, also compared to other countries in the region. But in general, the story here for Central and Eastern Europe in terms of the digital revolution when it comes to young people is actually also fairly positive for a lot of places. The final pressure point is the demographic crisis, which I think also very well known. Everybody in this group very familiar with this issue. I think on the left, we show the past, the story of the past. There's been this very substantial decline in populations across the region, especially in working age populations. It's obviously a challenge to the growth model. Mirrored what's happened in Western Europe, where there's been population growth. And we know a lot of that is because people from Central and Eastern Europe have gone to Western Europe to work, which has solved in a way what would have otherwise also been a demographic crisis for Western Europe. In the future, we think this can only get worse. On the right, we show calculations that we did both pre and post COVID pandemic, looking at the year at which, based on current trends, labor demand would equal labor supply. So basically economies would run out of workers. The gray bar is pre-COVID. At that point, we thought this is basically imminent for a lot of the region, also for Germany, by the way, which I put on this chart. So this would happen in the first few years of the 2020s. With COVID, obviously much lower growth, that is pushed back. But these calculations were done in the autumn when we did the main part of the study. Since then, of course, the economic situation's improved again quite a lot. And I think if we did this again today, these orange bars would come back again and we'd be looking again at this demographic crunch really hitting the economies by 2025 for most of Central and Eastern Europe. So putting that all together, we did a SWOT analysis. I definitely cannot go through all of this now, but I would just briefly summarize, I mean, the strengths that we see are a pretty decent convergence performance and a pretty high level of stability by Central and Eastern European standards. You know, if you look at the countries we're talking about here, if you look at them from the Balkans or from the former Soviet Union, it looks like a success story. Sophisticated export sector, some comparative advantages in this functional specialization. Interestingly, we found, especially in the pharmaceutical sector, it's a different story. It's a more positive story. Environmental progress, we see good quality of workforce and progress on the digital economy. So these are the strengths. The weaknesses are, of course, the demographics, this over-specialization in production, especially outside of the pharmaceutical industry, slow adaptation to change in the automotive sector, low R&D, still a long way to go on the green transition, some weaknesses in the digital economy, but that is more, I would say, countries like Romania and Bulgaria, less so Hungary, and in some cases also the education systems. The opportunities are to build on what seems to be more of a success in breaking this functional specialization trap in the pharmaceutical sector, nearshoring, much discussed as a result of the pandemic, more FDI in the services sector, potentially also as a result of the pandemic, digital revolution, green transition on the back of the pandemic, and automation. And automation potentially as a way to address also these labor shortages. The threats, on the other hand, are this potential quite serious functional specialization trap, a continued reliance on low labor costs, backshoring. If automation really happens in a very strong way, that companies simply bring everything back to Germany, structural change in the automotive sector, the inequalities that can come as a result of digital transformation and a digital-led growth model, and there's some of that in the Baltic states, for example, in the front runners, and the societal lock-in on fossil fuels. So I come now to the final section, to the policy proposals, and we try to frame this as a sense of, okay, there are threats, we have to deal with the threats, but there are also opportunities in this, and we have to try to grasp those as well. And there's really a lot in the policy part, and I just have a few minutes to summarize or state the key points before we discuss. So the first part is to use the monetary and fiscal space that is available. Don't repeat the mistakes of last time. I think we're on a good track in that sense, by the way, and also to work to create more policy space within the EU fiscal rules, to try to change the debate in a way about fiscal and monetary policy at the EU level, to support economies through this transition. The second is to really try to expand activity beyond production and to really build up logistics and R&D and headquarter services, to think about what's gone well in the pharmaceutical sector in that sense, to use industrial policy, because industrial policy can be used even within the EU, to create national innovation systems based on innovation, support research and development, intensify the links between the key ministries, universities, and the private sector. So something in the direction of this so-called entrepreneurial state, and to maximize all resources available from the EU for these kind of efforts. The third key block is to direct resources to the new sectors, the sectors where the economies of the region really have potential. For example, the digital economy, to try to learn from the front runners like Estonia, I already mentioned, take advantage of what is actually quite strong human capital in the region in this regard, to help the SMEs, because of course they are structurally disadvantaged by this compared to bigger firms, and to really help the labor market transition, which will be significant to this new digital economy, especially for older workers. The fourth major block is the green transition, and to really see this as an opportunity and to reframe how it's seen in a lot of the region, use the Just Transition Fund resources, improve innovation capacity, and really try to avoid this so-called factory economy also in the green sector. So previously the region has fallen into that a bit in manufacturing, try to avoid that in the green sector, and look for leapfrogging opportunities. So one of the findings is that the region is not far behind Western Europe on this. There is not a huge lock-in as there are in other industries where Western Europe is much further ahead, and so there could be leapfrogging opportunities here. The fifth block is automation, and to support automation and see it as a way, not a threat, but a way to meet these demographic challenges. We have some stuff on minimum wages in the study, targeting a higher minimum wage, try to push the automation of lower skilled jobs, ease the transition to new jobs, use the education system for that, active labor market policies, including extensive retraining to help workers transition to the new kind of jobs that will come out of this. And the final block is to think about the social fallout. And this is, again, a reason why we try to frame this as a second transition, to really think about this. You know, the region 30 years ago went through one really wrenching, in many ways, traumatic transition. This is also a transition, a real structural transition that the region is going to go through, and the social costs have to be much more taken into account. So making sure the welfare system bears the costs of this transition, not workers themselves, thinking about how to fund it, more progressive income taxes, for example, thinking very much about the urban-rural disparities, which are not specific to Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, that's also very much a theme for Western Europe, and also a favorite topic of our director, Mario Holzner, to provide the means for a good life to young families. So thinking about childcare and green spaces in cities and affordable housing and that kind of thing. So that was it. I tried to give at least a summary in the time I was given. So just to conclude briefly, the development performance of the region so far has not at all been bad, especially when you compare it to a lot of the rest of Central and Eastern Europe outside the EU. But the wealthier parts of the region, at least, may be hitting a limit, and it's time to think, and it was even before the pandemic, time to think about this and what the next growth model could be. The over-specialization in manufacturing production, the mega trends, and the pandemic are going to threaten and put pressure on this growth model now and in the future. Policymakers have to be active. They have to make sure they take the opportunities of this second transition for the region. If policy is used well, we think there's a positive case for the region. Convergence can certainly continue in the 2020s and beyond. But if we don't do anything, if policymakers don't do anything, there's a risk of getting stuck permanently at a relatively low level of development compared to say Germany, and then having to deal with the political and social consequences of that. So thank you for your attention. There are a few more slides. I think you will get this later with a bit more detail on some of that stuff if you're interested. And I look forward to responses and questions that you have.